Paul's so wordy that when I was a kid and we had to go to Sunday school and we would read Paul's letters, I always wondered, is there not some way that you could just pick a few sentences out to help us know what he said? Kind of feel that way. But some of what Paul's doing when he's writing this letter to the church in Galatians is he's trying to be as clear as possible for them, if not for us, what the point is. We talked about the first chapter last week and Paul's need to write to the churches in Galatia to say, hey, what happened to you? I came, I preached, I told you about the living Christ. I told you that everything from here on out is about grace, not law. And people show up down there and start preaching another gospel. And in essence, Paul would say, if using today's vernaculars, you sold your souls. Sold yourselves out to these people who came and disagreed with me. Because Paul is so emphatic about being right, he would say, why don't you listen to me? I've got it. I understand it. And so we get to what we call the second chapter, and we find that Paul has received another revelation, and it precipitates an action. What we're going to find throughout all of Galatia and through much of Paul's writings is that the church was constantly going through conflict because there was no one truly defining doctrine until about 300 years later. There was no one saying, well, this is how it is and what Jesus meant until much later. And so early on, the conflicts we get, and the book of Acts is all about this, is the church forming and what message was going to grip the heart of those in the church. And it had to do with attention. And what we find when we read these letters, but later read church history, we get this sense that at many places and at many times there has been conflict within churches and the larger church, and people sat down and found a way to compromise. That can be a problem. I can't. You know what? I had one of those senior moment blankouts. And so there were those three components that especially a part of our UCC tradition that goes back to the Christian part of it, which were renegade Methodist, renegade Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians, Baptist, spread out. There was this little motto that came out, and I can't remember what the first part is, something about diversity, but in essentials, unity, but in all things, charity. The problem is, what are the essentials? And people find themselves too often counting the essentials not according to the scriptures and the scriptural narrative, but the scriptures based upon either their economic interest or their cultural teachings. And therefore, they move far away from who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. Go back to the early days of our country. Let's go back to, let's say, the 1840s, when things were heating up. And the slavery issue was becoming more and more a part of the divisiveness of our country. There were those, and I'm so proud of this, I don't really like in today's age to brag about denominationalism because so often denominations have been wrong and they're always messy. But our Congregationalist forebears, for the most part, understood clearly that slavery was nothing more than an economic evil and must be resisted. And so the abolitionists stood firm and they preached the gospel according to their understanding about the evils of slavery. You know, the first college where an African American could get the same degree as a white person, you know what college that was? Anybody? I'm just doing a history lesson. This is not germane exactly, but Oberlin in Ohio. They got it. They understood. Sadly, though, over and over again, compromise tried to be reached. And just as it was never reached in our country, it wasn't ever reached in our churches. And so, as we came up to the Civil War, the Methodists split. The Baptists split. The Presbyterians split. People split all over the place. And I ask myself over and over again, how? How can you possibly split over the essential that Christ died for all, loves all, and slavery can never be tolerated? And yet it did. Compromise takes place. People get uneasy and they try to take... So people get compromised with evil. This book of Galatians, we've got Paul struggling with an issue where he saw the essential being so important that there was no room for compromise. But yet, he tried to go up to Jerusalem to do exactly that without giving up the true essence of the gospel. So he goes up there. There's a so-called private meeting at this Council of Jerusalem. And he meets with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, disciples. He takes Titus. Paul and Barnabas had been circumcised. Circumcision, as you know, was the symbol for the Moses covenant, the covenant made with Moses at the time the great liberation narrative started. It was the quintessential designation of being Jewish, a descendant of Abraham and Sarah. Titus went with Paul and Barnabas, but had never been circumcised. He wasn't Jewish and had not been compelled to be Jewish. They didn't ask Titus to be circumcised out of respect for the gospel. There they met, and it was agreed. Paul would continue preaching to the non-Jews, the Greek-speaking Gentiles, doing what Paul had been doing. Peter and the other leaders would continue ministering in Jerusalem. Okay? And there was an honoring of that ministry. The only thing that Paul and Barnabas were asked to do is to remember the orphans and the widows in the Jerusalem church and to take up an offering to help support them. And it was an act of charity Paul had no problem with. Compromise had come, and in Paul's mind, at least at that moment, compromise had come without giving up the essence of the gospel. Then we find that Peter comes down to Antioch. And Peter is apparently enjoying himself. Maybe he's having a little pork on the side, right? He's kind of messing with those dietary laws. And he's thinking, well, it's not so bad to be a Gentile. He's eating with the Gentile population the common meal. Excuse me. Suddenly, those who were the Judaizers, those who were insisting that you had to not only become Jewish, but observe Jewish law in order to follow the ways of Jesus, shows up, and Peter gets up departs from the Gentile, the common meal, and goes up to observe the dietary laws of the Jews who were present. And for Paul, that was not just a bridge too far. Paul was pretty much ready to blow up the bridge. He had so thought that the church had found a way forward. And here Peter, one of the most significant leaders in the church, one of the most significant disciples of Jesus, was willing to compromise by acting and promoting the idea that one must observe Jewish law if one was going to follow the ways of the living Christ. And that was too much. And so Paul simply sets out this blistering argument that says, you know, if you're a Jew and you come over and act like a Gentile, but you continue to maintain this idea that you've got to be a Jew, you've missed the point. Now, with all due respect, our brothers and sisters historically out of the Roman Church, it's not the behavior you would expect it out of a pope. Peter, in Paul's mind, was guilty of hypokristos. It's the root for hypocrite, except it's not hypocrite as we understand it. It stands for being an apostate, someone who has turned his or her back on the faith. Through the years, the centuries, the church has struggled with this. It finally got past, long after Pentecost had taught everybody the truth that the Spirit will blow where it will and God's grace will abound. Long after that, the church got past the whole problem of people needing to be Jewish. But then the church began developing its own rituals, its own doctrines, its own set, denying it was law, but make no mistake about it, it was always a little bit about law. Well, you know, if you're going to be a true Christian, you're going to agree with this set of doctrine. If you're going to be a true Christian, you're going to do things this way. If you're going to be a true Christian, which is why the church has never been united, especially since the Reformation, and truthfully never will be. Because people who want to control and spin the message are always requiring stuff of people in order for them to feel justified before God. Once again, Galatians you're going to have that same message over and over again. If you think that there's something you have to do to make God happy with you, then you have lost your way. If you think that others need to be a certain way, and you know what that way is, you have lost the way. Because the word is now and always has been grace. Sam Keene, who was one time the editor of Psychology Today, related a story. And it was about a time he was asked to speak at the United Nations. And all of his life, he had apparently had a struggle with wanting to achieve, to go up the, to climb up the ladder of professional success. And the story is told that he spoke at the UN, and he went back to his hotel room in New York City and broke into tears and wept. It was what one of my old spiritual heroes, John Claypool, called the cotton candy syndrome. Where you want something and you're sure that will fulfill you, and you take the bite, and it's so sweet, and then there's nothing there. And in that cotton candy moment, Sam Keen, we're told, threw himself across the bed and cried out, my God, what must I do to be saved?" And he said he heard it as if somebody was writing it on the wall, and the word came to him, nothing. Nothing at all. Either it comes with the territory or it doesn't come at all. Paul saying to those Judaizers, no, you have to do nothing in order to be justified before God, because it's what God has done for us all. Somebody in another place, another time, got really mad at me because I preached too much grace. And well, like me, she grew up Baptist too. She intellectually understood, but within her guts, she could never get over the fact that there's things that we just must do. If I commit to give to the church out of the goodness of what God's given to me, we call that stewardship. That's because I'm compelled by the love of God, not by law, to want to share the blessings with others. If I give my time and gifts to the church, and by the way, those 10 months I was retired, the church we belonged to, I tried to give my gifts. They just weren't too happy to have them. The choir thought I needed some improvement, and then there were all kinds of things, right? But if I choose to give my gifts, it's because I'm compelled out of love to share those gifts. But it's not because I want to get God's favor or earn brownie points. If we strive as disciples and followers of Jesus to be merciful and kind, it is because it comes from hearts full of love. It's not because of law. And so, it's not about will. It's always about grace. And when the grace floods your soul, it gets so much easier to know how to respond to those in the world who would tear it asunder, who would exploit people, who would misuse the world that God's given us. But we must keep ourselves centered in the word of grace, for that's the joy of living in the living Christ. God help us. God help me, that we may find our way forward being a people of grace.